So, hi guys, me, Tim and Toby were back for the second episode of the rise and fall of the German Empire, or really Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. So, this episode, episode 2, will be looking at the fall of Germany from so basically the start of the the fall of Germany, the really dread that Hitler wanted, from 1942 to 1945. So as I said in kind of the end of the last video, episode 1, which was, by the way, in 2 parts, we spoke about how Operation Barbarossa started in June, so it started in the summer months. Germany was all prepared with clothing and everything for the summer. By the time December the next year of 42 comes along, 1942, minus 30 degrees, winter kicked in. The Russians had basically bluffed Germany into to capture Stalingrad. Then Russians enclosed the Germans in Stalingrad, basically trapping millions of them. And then, of course, the cold set in. Germany, didn't have any really cold, warm clothing, so they had to make do what they did. And 70 to 90 million Germans died from the hail of gunfire, and of course from the cold. And from that point onwards, Hitler and the German army basically collapsed, fell apart, really, because of they fought too strong of an opponent, really, Russia, which is, of course, Russia was far bigger than Germany through all seasons of the war. So another thing is, which Toby will do a bit of explaining in a sec, but Germany was losing a lot of money and resources, mainly weapons and uniforms and clothing and helmets, of course, from the M40, and then simplified. Mainly, these are simplified weapons and helmets and clothing, everything, basically cutting costs because they didn't have any money. So, do you want to do your addy bit on this one, Toby? Oh, yep, so poor connection. Hang on a minute, we'll be back in a sec.
Yes, to start more comments videos, I'll be up and running very soon. The video, so as Tim said, Germany was really in a ball state, although you end up with, just as an example, the money itself actually declined in quality. Was in my collection, and I have no German World War II coins, and the early ones are, pretty weighted, very well made, and then the late ones are just as light as a feather. They really weigh nothing. And the reason for all of this was simply because not only was Germany putting vast amounts of money into developing things, but they had already spent so much throughout the war that it was gradually just on the verge of an implosion. And as a result, the quality of just everything they made suffered. So let's just say, fairly well-known example here, the Tiger tank is, it used to have rubber-rimmed wheels, but except the drive sprocket, obviously, but that's another thing. Whereas later in the war, they just made those rims out of steel because it was cheaper, because Germany did not really have access to rubber, and the synthetic rubber factories were just being bombed 24/7 by the American Air Force and the RAF.
Yeah, well said, Toby. So yeah, another thing with Germany is, starting from 1942/1943, the German army was spending vast quantities of their own money on secret weapons like the mouse tank or the rat tank, which were too big and too cumbersome and too expensive to make, and they weren't really doing anything. Of course, they were, supplying the army, but not as much when they did in 39 and 40, based at the start of the 2 years of the war. Because a lot of Germans had just laid down their arms and said forget about it, because by this point, Russia had really broken the niche line of successes that Germany was having before 1942. So it's kind of, what's the point of continuing? And then when you get into the summer of 1943, German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjägers, and the German army had invaded Italy. Then literally just a couple of days later, the Allies, American and British troops, had invaded Italy to push the Germans out of Italy as well, which again was a massive blow for the German armed forces as well. And then by the time 1944 comes along, mainly, of course, as we know very famously, June 6th, which was a Tuesday, 1944, of course, before that, the Allies, Canadian, Scottish, British, American troops planned a big, massive assault on the Normandy coast, D-Day, or Deliverance Day, as it was known as, Operation Overlord, which, of course, Germany couldn't really do much in terms of bringing up tanks to Normandy, because the whole idea around Normandy before the campaign was the British would set up dummy airfields and dummy telegraph wires and communications to outwit the Germans, to say that, we're landing at the Pas de Calais, of course. So that means all the Germans rushed to the Pas de Calais and stayed there. And of course they weren't. It was actually to Normandy. The real place they were landing was Normandy. So that's what that means. They would divert the German army, to the Pas de Calais instead of the actual invasion. And the Panzers hadn't, the Panzer crewmen and the Panzers, the German tank units hadn't actually had any information about it of movement. They just stayed where they were until they actually had somebody telling them what to do, which of course, June this was, but by August 1944, that was when they actually finally got some word out of who's doing what. It was very late. Right, June, July, August, so basically 2 months after the whole invasion. And Adolf Hitler was asleep, as you do on on the eve of a big invasion. Of course, nobody wanted to wake him up because he was too tired, and if you wake the Führer up, he's going to be mad. And another thing, if you go back to the German fall, the fall of the Third Reich, in July 1944, there was the assassination plot against Hitler. Once that happened, Hitler basically dishonoured and really, didn't really care about all his German officers, because it was his fellow German officers who planned to assassinate him. So he was very, very, very suspicious on any other German officers he talked to. There's only a very, very set number of officers he spoke to, very little numbers of them. So again, the German officers really kind of felt left out, really. Their own Führer doesn't really care about them as such. And if I go back a bit to 1943, the Battle of Kursk in 1943, which actually, Toby, do you want to explain?
Yes, so the Führer, or Adolf Hitler as he's otherwise known, decided, well, as well as a few other generals, a lot of people just blame it on Hitler, but a lot of generals did come up with this idea, decided there was a large salient around Kursk, so the Soviet forces had driven kind of a weird bulge into the German lines, and they were going to try and cut that off by basically going to either edge of the bulge at the back and then just sort of slicing it off around the city of Kursk. So they really did throw a lot, and I do mean a lot, of stuff into this. However, the Soviets had actually been preparing. They knew where the attack was coming, and prepared massive amounts of defences. I think the Germans expected something like 2 or 3 lines of defences, but certainly not the something like 5 that the Soviets actually had made. And as a result, the going just became murderously slow, really bogged down. It didn't help some German units anyway, that, you know, a lot of the time you hear about new tanks coming in at Kursk, so the Panther and the Tiger, no, not the Tiger, sorry, the Elephant, which is a very, very big, very, very cumbersome tank destroyer based on the Porsche version of the... Now, these things, the Panthers went on to become a very, very deadly opponent. The Elephants, still deadly, but very, very cumbersome. The Elephants had the famous issue of they didn't actually originally have a bow machine